In just 39 seconds of pure devastation, America watched Republican leadership completely implode. They didn't defend the diversion. They couldn't explain the golf trips. They just called it a total disgrace, but not the scandal. The exposure. Representative Dan Goldman methodically revealed their $300 million FEMA golf trip scandal. Cameras captured their total breakdown in real time. What did this New York congressman uncover that made GOP leaders have the most catastrophic meltdown in congressional history? May 14, 2025, 2:23 p.m. The Longworth House Office Buildings Committee Room 1310 hummed with tension. Representative Dan Goldman walked in, carrying a thick manila folder marked FEMA Oversight, Classified Financial Records, in bold red letters. His dark hair was disheveled from hours of preparation, his charcoal suit wrinkled from sleepless nights reviewing evidence, but his face set with prosecutorial determination. Across the witness table sat Republican House leadership, including Majority Leader Steve Scalise and Appropriations Chair Kay Grager, their expensive suits pressed, despite mounting scandals, but their hands showing visible tremors. The hearing had been scheduled as routine FEMA oversight. Republican leadership had prepared for friendly questioning about disaster operations, but Goldman had spent months conducting a secret investigation that uncovered systematic FEMA fund diversions to Trump properties. Majority Leader Scalise, Chairwoman Granger. Goldman began with prosecutorial authority. I want to focus on FEMA's budget management. Are you aware that FEMA has transferred $300 million in disaster relief funds to cover expenses related to President Trump's golf trips since The number hit like a financial earthquake. $300 million diverted from hurricane victims to fund presidential recreation. Scalise's confident expression flickered. Congressman Goldman, I would need to review specific expenditure reports before commenting. FEMA follows all applicable financial protocols. Goldman wasn't fooled by bureaucratic evasion. This isn't about reviewing reports. This is about systematic diversion of disaster relief funds. Let me be specific. Are you aware that FEMA paid $47 million for Secret Service golf cart rentals at Trump properties? The escalation was devastating. $47 million spent on golf cart rentals, while disaster victims needed homes. Granger attempted damage control. Emergency management involves complex security requirements and logistical support. Interagency fund transfers are standard procedure for comprehensive protection. The euphemisms were transparent. Security requirements meant protecting Trump while golfing. Logistical support meant funding recreational activity. Are you seriously suggesting Trump's golf trips constitute crisis operations? Goldman pressed. Or are you acknowledging systematic looting of disaster relief funds? Granger's response revealed her moral bankruptcy. The committee ensures adequate funding for all aspects of executive protection during emergencies. Sometimes that requires flexible budget management. Goldman had more devastating evidence. Are you aware that FEMA diverted $89 million in hurricane relief funds to pay for catering at Trump golf resorts? The revelation was explosive and morally obscene. $89 million appropriated for hurricane victims used to pay for luxury catering at Trump properties, while disaster survivors lived in trailers and FEMA trailers. DHS had explicitly ordered the transfer of funds designated for victim assistance to cover presidential dining expenses. Scalise's panic was now visible to everyone watching the hearing. Congressman, I would need to review specific financial documentation before commenting on particular expenditure categories. The committee follows all applicable oversight procedures for emergency fund management. It was another desperate stall tactic, the kind of evasion used by officials who knew they were caught but hoped to delay their destruction until after the cameras stopped rolling. But Goldman had spent too much time preparing for this moment to let Republican leadership escape through procedural technicalities. Majority Leader Scalise, Goldman continued with prosecutorial precision. I have here the specific financial documentation I'm referring to. These are internal FEMA transfer orders signed by Republican leadership. Would you like me to read some of these orders into the record? Goldman held up official FEMA documents that made both Scalise and Granger visibly pale. These weren't leaked rumors or anonymous sources. These were official government communications showing the systematic diversion of disaster funds by the highest levels of Republican congressional leadership. This transfer order, dated March 15, 2025, states, authorization granted for emergency fund, reallocation in the amount of $23.7 million to cover executive protection catering expenses at Mar-a-Lago Resort for the period March 20. The funds were taken directly from hurricane relief appropriations for Puerto Rico. The smoking gun was now public record. Republican leadership had explicitly authorized the transfer of hurricane relief funds to pay for Trump's luxury dining, while Puerto Rican families still lived without electricity from previous storms. It was morally monstrous and legally indefensible. Majority Leader, Chairwoman Goldman's voice carried the weight of prosecutorial authority and moral outrage. This document shows you personally authorized stealing hurricane relief funds to pay for Trump's resort dining. How do you justify taking money from disaster victims to fund presidential luxury? The moral weight of the question was crushing. How do you defend stealing from hurricane victims to pay for luxury catering? How do you explain prioritizing presidential Gulf dining over disaster victim housing? How do you justify congressional leadership personally signing orders to loot emergency funds? But Goldman had saved his most devastating evidence for last. Let me ask you about the human cost of your flexible budget management. Are you aware that FEMA denied disaster relief to 2,847 families because funds had been diverted to cover Trump's Gulf expenses? The number was staggering and heartbreaking. 2,847 families? Real people with destroyed homes, lost possessions, shattered lives, denied federal assistance because their relief money had been stolen to pay for presidential recreation. The human cost of Republican corruption was measured in American families left homeless so Trump could play golf. Granger attempted one final evasion. Congressman, disaster relief involves complex eligibility determinations based on multiple criteria. Individual case outcomes reflect comprehensive assessment processes. But Goldman had documented evidence that destroyed even this pathetic excuse. Chairwoman, I have internal FEMA communications showing explicit orders to deny relief applications due to insufficient available funds, while simultaneously authorizing Gulf-related transfers. You personally signed orders prioritizing Trump's recreation over disaster victim assistance. At exactly 3:27 p.m., the Republican leadership experienced their complete psychological and political collapse. For 39 devastating seconds, instead of defending their actions, instead of expressing remorse for the suffering they'd caused, instead of acknowledging their betrayal of disaster victims, they launched into a desperate attack that revealed the complete bankruptcy of their moral position. Congressman Goldman, this is a total disgrace. You're using tragedy to score political points while undermining legitimate emergency management. These partisan attacks on fiscal flexibility help disaster victims by creating bureaucratic chaos. We refuse to apologize for ensuring comprehensive executive protection during national emergencies. The 39-second breakdown was devastating. Not to Goldman, but to Republican leadership themselves. The cameras captured every moment of their meltdown. Their complete inability to defend stealing from disaster victims with facts or morality. Their transformation from fiscal responsibility champions into desperate political operatives attacking oversight itself. The officials entrusted with emergency management had just revealed that they viewed accountability for stealing disaster funds as a total disgrace. Goldman remained calm, professional, and devastatingly effective. I asked you about 2,847 families denied disaster relief so Trump could play golf. Your response tells us everything we need to know about your priorities. The contrast was stark and politically fatal. Goldman focused on disaster victim welfare and documented evidence of fund diversion. Republicans resorted to personal attacks and political deflection, while calling accountability disgraceful. The difference between public servants protecting emergency funds and political operatives looting them for presidential recreation was crystal clear. The immediate aftermath was swift and merciless. Social media exploded with clips of the 39-second Republican breakdown. They're calling accountability disgraceful. Their defense of stealing disaster funds for golf trips. Golfgate trended within minutes. quickly followed by 39 seconds of disgrace and stolen disaster funds. Government accountability experts were stunned by the evidence Goldman had presented and the Republican response. Former FEMA directors from both parties issued joint statements expressing alarm that congressional leadership had systematically looted disaster funds for presidential recreation. The Government Accountability Office announced immediate investigation of what they called the most serious misappropriation of emergency funds in federal history. The Federal Emergency Management Agency itself was thrown into complete operational crisis as career disaster relief officials realized their leadership had been systematically stealing from victims to fund presidential golf trips. Resignation letters flooded in as emergency managers, disaster relief coordinators, and victim assistance specialists understood they could no longer serve in an agency that prioritized presidential recreation over human suffering. Republican members of Congress who'd supported the leadership's fiscal flexibility found themselves in impossible political positions. How do you defend stealing hurricane relief funds for golf cart rentals? How do you justify denying disaster relief to 2,847 families so Trump could dine at luxury resorts? Even the most partisan Trump supporters struggled to explain away the systematic looting of emergency funds for presidential recreation. The international reaction was swift and deeply concerned. Foreign disaster relief organizations began questioning whether they could continue cooperation with an American emergency management system that diverted victim assistance funds to presidential golf expenses. The United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction issued a diplomatic statement expressing concern about reported irregularities in U.S. emergency fund management, unprecedented international criticism of American disaster relief priorities. Disaster victim advocacy groups were outraged by the revelation that their relief funds had been systematically stolen for Trump's recreation. The National Disaster Relief Coalition issued a statement calling for immediate resignation of all Republican leadership involved in the diversion. Hurricane survivor organizations demanded congressional investigation of every denied relief application. Wildfire victim advocates accused the Trump administration and Republican leadership of betraying those who'd lost everything so the president could maintain his golf schedule. Within 72 hours of Goldman's systematic destruction, career FEMA officials were resigning in numbers that threatened to collapse disaster response operations. The exodus included some of the most experienced emergency managers in the federal government, men and women who'd spent decades coordinating disaster relief, all abandoning their careers rather than participate in what one called the systematic theft from disaster victims to fund presidential luxury. The legal challenges were immediate and devastating. Federal prosecutors announced criminal investigation of the fund diversions under federal theft and corruption statutes. State attorneys general whose disaster victims had been denied relief while funds went to golf trips filed civil suits seeking recovery of stolen funds. Ethics investigators opened cases against every Republican leader who'd signed diversion authorizations. The political damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Republican approval ratings on disaster management collapsed as voters learned their representatives had stolen from hurricane victims to fund presidential golf trips. Moderate Republicans facing re-election began distancing themselves from leadership, calling for accountability and fund recovery. Several Republican senators demanded resignation of House leadership involved in the diversions. 6 months later, facing criminal investigation, complete loss of credibility on fiscal responsibility, and disaster victim organizations calling for prosecution, both Scalise and Granger quietly announced they wouldn't seek re-election. Their departure statements made no mention of the 2,847 families denied relief or the $300 million diverted to golf trips, perhaps because any acknowledgement of the diversions would constitute admission of federal crimes. Goldman's interrogation became legendary in oversight circles as a masterclass in financial accountability and moral authority. Government watchdog organizations began using the hearing as required viewing for courses on congressional oversight and fiscal responsibility. The systematic exposure of disaster fund diversions became a standard case study in how democratic institutions could expose corruption when wielded by prosecutors who prioritized victims over politics. The broader impact extended far beyond Republican leadership to fundamental questions about the relationship between emergency management and political priorities in American democracy. If FEMA funds could be diverted for presidential golf trips while disaster victims were denied relief, what other emergencies were subordinated to political convenience? If oversight could be dismissed as disgraceful, how could disaster victims trust government assistance? The Federal Emergency Management Agency, under new leadership, spent years rebuilding the fiscal integrity and victim prioritization that Republican leadership had destroyed. New protocols were implemented, requiring multiple approvals for any fund transfers outside disaster relief. Political diversions were explicitly prohibited in all emergency operations. Victim assistance was prioritized over any non-emergency expenditures. But the human cost was irreversible. The 47 families denied disaster relief, while their funds went to golf trips faced years of financial hardship that could have been prevented. Hurricane victims who lost their homes lived in inadequate temporary housing because their relief money had been diverted to pay for presidential recreation. The betrayal of trust between disaster victims and emergency management would take generations to rebuild. Years later, when historians studied the collapse of public trust in emergency management under corrupt leadership, Goldman's interrogation was cited as a crucial moment when oversight exposed the systematic prioritization of political luxury over human suffering. His methodical questioning had revealed the complete moral bankruptcy of officials who would steal from disaster victims to fund presidential golf trips. The 39 seconds when Republican leadership completely lost control became a viral symbol of what happens when political operatives prioritize presidential recreation over human welfare. Their breakdown wasn't just personal failure, it was the sound of moral authority collapsing under the weight of documented corruption. Broadcast live for disaster victims across America, Goldman's simple insistence on accountability for disaster funds became a defining example of how congressional oversight could protect vulnerable Americans from systematic government theft. When faced with evidence that emergency funds were being diverted for presidential golf trips, he didn't accept bureaucratic euphemisms about fiscal flexibility. He demanded answers and justice for victims. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't a criminal prosecution or media investigation. It's a congressman who refuses to accept the theft of disaster relief funds as acceptable administrative practice. 39 seconds of calling accountability disgraceful revealed more about Republican priorities than years of campaign rhetoric about fiscal responsibility could have obscured.